Hello there and welcome back. This is Chapter 3 of my complete guide to keeping and breeding the sparkling gourami. In this chapter, we'll be looking at the spawning process of these amazing little fish. But before we look at them breeding, let's do a quick review of how I set up their tank. Now, for those of you in the US, this is a 10-gallon tank, and for those of you in the rest of the world, that converts to 38 liters. This aquarium does not have a filter, so it relies on bright light and rapid plant growth to process most of the waste products produced by the fish, making filtration unnecessary. My decision not to use a filter is due to the fact that sparkling gouramis need calm water, so this non-filtered approach works perfectly for these fish. There are 2 males and 4 females in here, and they've been breeding regularly for the past 2 or 3 weeks. The water is relatively soft and the temperature hovers near 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, while the pH typically stays around 6.5. I'm using a very bright full-spectrum plant light on this tank, and I leave it on for about 10 to 12 hours each day, which has fueled rapid growth of the frog bit as well as quite a bit of algae. This has been done intentionally to create a dense, swamp-like habitat where there's limited visibility from one side of the aquarium to the other. This murky environment makes it fairly difficult for these fish to see each other, which helps keep aggression to a minimum. In fact, a fish on the right side of this aquarium can barely see a fish on the left side, even though it's less than a couple feet away. Here, a male and female are courting near the male's bubble nest as they prepare to spawn. In many egg-laying species, it's common for the female to lift her head and turn on her side to expose her enlarged abdomen, presumably to show the male that she's ripe with eggs and ready to spawn. But that's just an assumption on our part, and they may have another reason for this behavior that we're unaware of. Nonetheless, it's the female rather than the male that makes the most elaborate displays during courtship, which is a bit unusual because it's normally the other way around for most fish species. They're also remarkably gentle with each other, and I haven't seen any aggression between them that you often see in other species when they're preparing to spawn. And now we can see the pair embrace each other just beneath the bubble nest. The male quickly wraps himself around the female just as she turns upside down. This position brings the breeding tubes of the male and female right next to each other so that the eggs and the milt of the male can make close contact during mating, which ensures adequate fertilization of the eggs as they emerge from the female. But like many species, it takes them a few trial runs before the female releases any of her eggs. Here the pair attempt to embrace each other again, but the long tap roots of the frog bit are getting in the way, so it takes them a few tries before they can figure out exactly where they both need to be. And once again, their attempts to spawn are interrupted by the roots of the frog bit. This beautiful spawning embrace is very typical for all gouramis as well as bettas. And here, finally, the female releases her first egg, which is quickly caught by the male. And here comes another egg. Be sure to notice how quickly the male turns around to catch the eggs before they drop to the bottom of the tank. And by the way, the long anal fins seen on both gouramis and bettas is an adaptation that helps concentrate the eggs and the sperm when they mate. So those enlarged anal fins are not just there for locomotion, but they serve a reproductive function as well. And I love how the male knows to quickly turn around and look for the eggs just as soon as the mating embrace is over, because the female will eat the eggs if she gets to them before he does, so he has to be quick. He also has to keep an eye on me, and I don't think that he likes the fact that I'm so close to his nest. Here an egg falls to the substrate and it's quickly eaten by the female. She has no interest in caring for the eggs or the nest, so that role is left completely to the male. Furthermore, most gouramis have eggs that float, while the eggs of the sparkling gourami sink, so they must be caught by the male and then brought up to the bubble nest. Which makes perfect sense because sparkling gouramis don't build their bubble nests at the surface, preferring instead to position the nest beneath the waterline, so eggs that float would not be very effective. And just so you know, the floating eggs of other gourami species, such as the pearl gourami, the dwarf gourami, and the honey gourami, are all able to float because their eggs contain large oil droplets. And since oil is less dense than water, the eggs float up to the surface and into the bubble nest. But the sparkling gouramis play by their own rules, so their eggs sink, and they build their nest beneath the waterline, which is probably due to the fact that in the wild they inhabit very shallow bodies of water. So building a bubble nest right at the surface wouldn't be nearly as effective. And now it's time for a short commercial break because these ads help pay the bills. But don't go anywhere because there's still a lot more to see and learn that you're not going to find anywhere else. And we're back. Thanks for sticking around to see what's next. Here's the bubble nest just 15 minutes after the first eggs were laid, so it doesn't look like very much at all when they first begin to spawn, but each time the male adds a new egg, he adds a few more bubbles. Here's the same nest 15 minutes later. There are more bubbles now, and it's going to be a lot bigger by the time they're done. Another odd thing about the sparkling gourami is that the female releases several eggs at once, and they're usually stuck together, so they come out in clumps rather than as single eggs. And since the eggs are stuck together in a clump, after the male picks them up, he holds them in his mouth for a while to loosen them up before adding them individually to the bubble nest. It's also important to notice that during the spawning embrace of gouramis, the female turns upside down so that the eggs are ejected up towards the surface instead of down towards the substrate. Now, you could easily keep and breed a single pair of these fish in a 5.5-gallon tank, but be sure that it's densely planted so that the female has a few places to hide after they spawn, because the male will become very territorial. In some cases, it may even be necessary to remove the female for her own safety, but each setup is different and it really depends on the size of the tank, the hardscape, and the number of plants. If you'd like to keep a small group of sparkling gouramis, then it's best to have more females than males in order to limit aggression. A 20-gallon tank, or even something larger, would be needed as well. Large water changes can be a problem for nesting males because the changing water levels may affect the bubble nest, so keep that in mind when a male is guarding eggs or wrigglers. I prefer to do small, frequent water changes whenever possible, rather than doing less frequent, large changes, because stability is always preferred. Now, if you should happen to run into a situation where your fish are reluctant to lay eggs, then increasing the water temperature by a couple degrees might be helpful. Feeding them some live baby brine shrimp, daphnia, or blackworms wouldn't hurt either. And speaking of eating, these eggs will hatch 2 or 3 days from now, and then in another 2 or 3 days after that, the fry will be free swimming and looking for food. So, 1 week from now, I'll need to make sure that the baby fish will have lots of very tiny live foods to eat. A mature, densely planted aquarium with a couple pieces of driftwood and some snails will have lots of tiny creatures moving around that the babies can find and eat. But you'll also need to provide them with a fresh supply of infusoria every couple days. Then, after about 2 weeks, they should be able to eat newly hatched baby brine shrimp. However, in my experience, they grow painfully slow at first, and it seems to take forever before they can eat vinegar eels, microworms, or baby brine shrimp. And keep in mind, you'll also need to make sure that the babies aren't eaten by the adults. So once the fry are free swimming, it's best to remove the adults from the breeding tank. With this in mind, it's probably easiest to use just a single pair of fish for breeding, and then take the pair out as soon as the fry are ready to be on their own. And at this point, there's a very real benefit to using a larger, more seasoned aquarium for breeding, because it'll be home to a larger population of naturally occurring infusoria that will provide a near constant supply of food for the tiny fry. In fact, if you bred a pair of sparkling gouramis in a mature 55-gallon planted tank, I'd be willing to bet that you wouldn't need to feed the fry any infusoria at all, because they could probably survive on the stuff that was already there until they were big enough to eat baby brine shrimp. Now, that's just speculation on my part, but for anyone out there willing to devote a mature 55-gallon planted tank to a single pair of sparkling gouramis, this would be a fun, trouble-free experiment to try. If done correctly, you wouldn't need a filter and you wouldn't need to do water changes, because a pair of sparkling gouramis produce very little waste and don't need much food, so there's very little for you to do except sit back and wait. Just let them breed and then take the pair out when the fry are free swimming. There should be plenty of infusoria in a mature 55-gallon tank to keep the fry happy, so no need for you to worry about having to set up infusoria cultures. I would highly recommend putting several pieces of driftwood and other botanicals such as leaves in the tank, as well as bladder snails and ram's horn snails, all of which will help promote the growth of infusoria. It's also extremely important not to use any medications in the tank or add any other species of fish. And if everything goes as planned, when you're done, you'll have a 55-gallon planted tank with a whole colony of sparkling gouramis in it. And that brings this guide to keeping and breeding the sparkling gourami to a close. Thanks for watching, and I really hope that you have a beautiful day.